Welcome back to the channel, everybody. After spending 3 weeks in beautiful Ecuador, it's finally time for me to give my opinion on the Sony 200-600 G lens versus the 100-400 G Master lens. Before getting into it, I'm going to give the obligatory disclaimer that these are my experiences with both these lenses over the last 3 weeks. Everybody has a different shooting style, different subjects, different conditions, different expectations of both lenses. So, these are my experiences. Take them as you will. Obviously, everybody's going to have a different opinion. So if you have anything that opposes what I say, obviously leave it down below. I'd love to hear it. While I'm talking, I'm going to be showing as many images as I can, just so you guys don't have to look at me. You can actually look at some of the images taken with these lenses. And if you've watched some of my previous Ecuador videos, you'd probably recognize some of the photos, but I've added quite a few new ones. So at least it's going to be a little bit different from what you've already seen. So for this review, there's two sections that I really want to touch on, and that's usability of the lens. So the design, the autofocus, the handling, everything like that. And then the second part is the image quality. And right now, right here, I have the 200-600. I had to rent the 100-400 for the trip to Ecuador, but both lenses were extremely fun to use. I'd never felt handcuffed really while using either of them. And overall, I think after the trip was done, there was two really big points in terms of usability that stood out to me. And one leans in favor of the 200-600 and one leans in favor of the 100-400. The big point that leans in favor of the 200-600 is actually speed. Not necessarily speed of the lens itself, like autofocus, although that is a factor of it, but just I find due to the design, I'm actually quicker at finding my subject, acquiring focus, and getting photos off than I am with the 100-400. And I think the big reason for that is this zoom ring. It's super smooth and it only takes about a quarter turn to get from 200 to 600. So when I was in the forest especially, birds like to move around, hop around branches, it is relatively easy to lose your subject. And I just found I was so much quicker zooming out to 200, finding my subject again, and then zooming back in. And the 100-400 with that external zoom, it just felt so much longer than when I was using this lens. The fact that this lens goes out to 600 millimeters, it's very beneficial, especially on the A7R4, because in a lot of situations where the autofocus wasn't really picking up on the bird, what I was able to do was punch into 900 millimeters in crop mode, have near full autofocus coverage on the A7R4, and then I was just able to get my autofocus points on the eye of the bird, punch back out, and get the photo. And even if I don't need the crop mode at 900 millimeters, sometimes I will use it just because it's way easier to acquire the focus, and then you can always punch back out and get the full frame shot. On the 100-400 in crop mode, obviously you can only be out at 600 millimeters, so it is beneficial to have the longer lens in those situations. So in terms of getting the shot, I definitely felt like I was quicker with the 200-600, so I gave that a huge thumbs up because that's huge in wildlife photography. You want to get the shot. Using it, I just felt like it was more of a fluid process. It was just more natural than with the 100-400. So that was the biggest usability takeaway that I got from this lens after my trip. And for the 100-400, on the other hand, the biggest takeaway that I got was when I was using that lens, I felt more creative and less limited by the lens than I did with the 200-600. And the biggest reason for this is the minimum focusing distance. That is hands down the game changer for this lens. The minimum focusing distance for the 100-400 is 0.98 meters. And after using it for 3 weeks, that is top of the list of reasons why I would get that lens. For me, that's the game changer. It ranks higher than the image quality, the size, and the weight of that lens itself. I just find that the minimum focusing distance is probably one of the highest reasons to get that lens. When I was using the 200-600, my outlook was always looking further out because I have that reach. I can photograph things that are further, so I was always looking outwards. And when I was using the 100-400, my whole mentality changed, and suddenly I was walking through the forest slower. I was appreciating all these little things that I wouldn't even think of photographing with the 200-600. Not that it has a bad minimum focusing distance, it's better than my old Sigma, but it's just nothing compared to the 100-400. So everything was fair game. Insects on a flower, there was grubs at my feet. I was able to just take the lens, point downwards, and focus on things that were on the ground, so you get this nice top-down effect. So it was really, really cool. I also posted this photo of an animal in my community tab, and I asked you what you thought the lens and camera combination was. Some people got it, some people guessed the A7R4 with the 100-400, but more people actually guessed the Sony 90mm macro, which is incredible. The fact that you can use a telephoto lens and get macro-esque shots, it's incredible. It opens up your range, but the fact that you're just able to actually do that, it's mind-boggling. Like, you can get images that, could fool people that, hey, this might actually be a macro lens. I just find that extremely useful and versatile. I think if you're a generalist who does not only birds and mammals, but insects, reptiles, amphibians, flowers, you can't go wrong with the 100-400. I think overall, you're not going to miss anything with the 100-400. Whereas if you're using the 200 to 600, I think overall there are a few instances where you might say, man, I wish I had the 100 to 400. The one negative with the 100 to 400 is obviously at that long end. In some cases, when you're working with skittish wildlife, you might prefer to have the 600 millimeter since you can't get as close. But at the same time, when I was using the 100 to 400 and I was at a 400 and I didn't feel I was close enough, I didn't just give up. The wheels just started turning and you start thinking, how can I create a pleasing composition with what I have in the frame? And that goes back to the creativity thing I was talking about. I just felt with the 100 to 400, I was more creative. And sometimes when you have these bigger zooms, what ends up happening is you're just trying to fill the frame every single time and your shots could get repetitive, and that's one thing that I wanted to avoid on the trip. So in that regard, I give a huge thumbs up to the 100 to 400 for pushing my creativity, allowing me to get photos of subjects that I wouldn't necessarily go after with the 200 to 600, and overall just making me think a little bit more about composition. With that being said, there are a couple small negatives that I encountered with the 100 to 400, and the first one has to do with the minimum focusing distance. On the lens itself, on both the 200 to 600 and the 100 to 400, they have the focus limiter switch, but on the 100 to 400 they have full, so anything from minimum focusing distance out to infinity you can focus on. And then if you flip the switch, you have from 3 meters all the way out to infinity, but for some reason they didn't have a third switch from minimum focusing distance out to 3 meters. And that's one of the biggest benefits of the lens, is the minimum focusing distance. And what would happen a lot of times, especially when doing hummingbirds because they're so fast and it's sometimes hard to remove your finger from the AF on button right as they leave the frame, with the 100 to 400, since I had to be on full on the focus limiter, it would basically jump all the way to the background and I would have to zoom out and recompose, or I had to just go into manual focus and refocus back on the area I wanted. So that's just one thing. I wish they would have added a third option so you could have clicked it in for autofocusing at closer ranges. When I'm doing really close-up work, I usually go into manual. It's just way easier, and since you have such a narrow depth of field, you want to use manual focus so you know that you're getting what you want in focus. So yeah, it's just one small thing that I wish the lens would have had. Another thing that I encountered, and this is strictly personal preference, I found handheld I was getting better results with the 200 to 600. For myself, I do like having the extra weight in my hands. I find it just stabilizes and acts as a counterweight a little bit better, and I find that I'm able to get better results with a heavier lens. I find this happens a lot in video as well. When I'm doing handheld video, if I'm using one of the Sony crop sensors with the small kit lenses, I find I get worse results than if I'm using a heavier, bulkier setup. But yeah, that's completely subjective. That's my preference. I do enjoy having the extra weight of the 200 to 600 when I'm hand holding. I know a few people who also hand hold the 600 primes, so you know, everybody has their own style, but that's just one thing that I noticed handheld. I felt like I was getting better results with the 200 to 600. And one really minor thing that I did prefer on the 200 to 600, which is kind of irrelevant because you can always just replace the tripod foot, but I find the tripod foot extends past the custom function buttons on the lens itself. And on the 100 to 400 it actually stops before, and I found I was more prone to hitting the custom function buttons on the lens on the 100 to 400 than I was on the 200 to 600. Again, you can replace a tripod foot, or if you don't have like really large hands, you should be fine, but that was just one thing. I hit it quite a bit on the 100 to 400. So now let's get into the autofocus performance of both lenses, and to be quite honest, in all the situations that I used it in, there really wasn't a huge difference between the two from what I experienced. I did low light hummingbirds in flight, I did regular hummingbirds in flight, fruit feeder birds, birds in the forest, birds on the ground, and overall it was very, very similar, the results with both lenses. The one thing that I did pick up on is I find the autofocus on the 100 to 400 is a little bit more responsive to what's happening in the scene versus the 200 to 600. And it's not a huge difference, but I did notice it a little bit when I was focusing on similar settings with both lenses. I find that the 100 to 400 was just evaluating the scene a little bit quicker. But when it comes to actual bursts, and I was doing 10 or 20 image bursts, I mean, most of the percentage was pretty much the same in terms of hit rate. So it's not something that I can say is much better on the 100 to 400, but I do think that it is a little bit more responsive on that. But that's not to say that the autofocus on the 200 to 600 is bad in any way. It's actually pretty responsive as well. There was one scenario where I was photographing on some hummingbirds pretty close up, and I wanted to focus far out on the mountains because I saw something on the mountain. And what ended up happening was it was raining that day, and the lens actually picked up on the rain and it was tracking the raindrops throughout the screen as they were falling. So I found that was pretty cool, and I kept my sensitivity on normal for both lenses because I just wanted to try them at their base. The one real area that I wish I was able to try this in, and there just wasn't any opportunities for me to do that in the rainforest. There wasn't any lakes, there wasn't any open fields where there was raptors or shorebirds or gulls, was birds in flight while panning. So that's the one area that I couldn't test, and I think that's the area where, well, I'm assuming that there's probably the biggest gap between both these lenses in terms of focusing performance. I'm assuming the 100 to 400 would be better in those situations since I was seeing that it was a little bit more responsive. But yeah, like I said, I'll have to probably test that out again in another video. So in my experience, I give a thumbs up to both these lenses. They both performed very well, and you have to remember that this one is $500 cheaper, I'm from Canada. I gotta look it up. I don't know any prices. We pay people here in maple syrup. Yeah, so on B&H, it's $500 difference between this lens and the 100 to 400. So yeah, even if the autofocus is in fact less responsive in birds in flight with the 200 to 600, it's still a pretty good argument to still buy the lens if it's very close to the 100 to 400 and it's $500 cheaper. So if you're wondering about hit rates of both lenses, in my situation, it's a little bit harder to compare to traditional birds in flight because traditional birds in flight are usually out in the open. There's more ambient light that you're able to push your shutter speed up a little bit higher. But in my situation, I was in the rainforest and I think I saw the sun about a handful of times when I was there. So my situations were really dark. I was doing hummingbirds in flight, so one of the fastest subjects with some really slow shutter speeds. So I was getting around 20 to 40% keepers, which isn't great, but considering the conditions, it's actually pretty good. So I think if I compared these lenses in a normal birds in flight setting, I think it would be a little bit more indicative of what they're both capable of. But yeah, for me, the fact that I was able to get even one photo in focus in a sequence when you're doing hummingbirds in flight at 1/50th of a second, that's pretty cool. That's really awesome. So yeah, thumbs up to both these lenses. I really don't have anything bad to say about the autofocus of either of these lenses, which leads perfectly into the next section, which is image quality. And in terms of image quality, there's not as much of a difference as I thought there would be. Both are very good, but there is a reason the 100 to 400 is a G Master lens. The quality is better. It's a little bit sharper, it renders a little bit better, but I was really expecting a bigger difference between the two. I was reading some comments on some forums and some YouTube videos, and people were saying that the 200 to 600 at 600 millimeters is basically unusable. It's too soft. And you guys have seen my photos in the past couple of videos. I don't think that's the case at all. I think I could definitely say that at 600 millimeters, it is softer than the 100 to 400 at 400 millimeters. There's no way that I would call the results from the 200 to 600 unusable. If you're comparing this to a 600 prime, yeah, it's probably unusable. But if you're comparing it to, say, even the old 150 to 600 Sigmas or the Tamrons, I think the quality is great that comes out of the 200 to 600. That's why when you watch these reviews and you read comments and you read articles, you know, just take everything into consideration, but don't make decisions off of other people's comments, because one, you don't know, they might have had a bum lens, they might have had a bum camera. Two, they might be inexperienced. They might not know the difference between a soft lens and motion blur. And sometimes some people don't even try the lenses. They're just trolling people and saying that it's bad. So, you know, who really knows what people are doing on the internet? That's why I always suggest just get these in your hands and try them for yourself, because that's going to be the absolute factor of deciding whether you like the lens or not. But yeah, one thing I want to add is, although the image quality is a tad better on the 100 to 400, if you're somebody who does a lot of small birds and you notice that you're using the 100 to 400 and you're always at 400 and you're always doing heavier crops to get closer, you might just benefit from getting the 200 to 600, because even if the quality of the 100 to 400 is a little bit better, if you're doing these heavy crops, it's not going to be as nice as the full frame image on the 200 to 600 that's not cropped. So that's one thing to consider. I also think that you really need to evaluate what you photograph, what you want to photograph in the future. If you're somebody like me that does a lot of small birds but is also pivoting towards doing a lot of reptiles and amphibians, the 100 to 400 is very appealing. Yes, it is $500 more expensive, but if you're not somebody who does a lot of macro but you'd like to dabble in it, you can get that 100 to 400 and it's still cheaper than buying the 200 to 600 and buying a macro lens on top of it. So although the 100 to 400 isn't necessarily a true macro lens, it does give you similar results that you can definitely dabble in and practice, and then eventually maybe get your own macro lens if you want to do more of it. But that 100 to 400 is just, you know, one lens to rule them all. That lens just does everything, and it's small, it's compact, it's light. So if you're somebody who does a lot of trips, you go canoeing or hiking, backpacking, that's going to be really beneficial to save that space. I know people go crazy over saving, you know, half a pound in their kit. So saving that space and weight can be a huge benefit, especially if you're doing some international flights. Some airlines are really strict about the weight you can bring on your carry-on, so that's another thing you need to evaluate. After reviewing these two lenses, what's interesting is I didn't really make my decision based on autofocus performance or image quality like I originally thought I would. It was actually just more on usability. And for what I do a lot of small birds. Like I said in previous videos, I love warblers, I love smaller songbirds. So for me, the 200 to 600 will stay in my kit for now. Will that change in the future? Possibly. Like I said, I'm trying to pivot more and be more of a generalist, not just focusing solely on birds. So that 100 to 400 might become more and more appealing as I grow as a photographer. So both are really good lenses. I'm really sad I had to return the 100 to 400. I do miss it a little bit, but this is still a very capable lens, so I don't have any issues with using just this lens. So I can't really make a definitive decision like you should buy this lens, because I don't really know what you're photographing, what your style is. But if you're still really stuck, you can leave your comment down below of what type of photography you do, what type of photography you want to do in the future, and I can just kind of give you my 2 cents, what I think that I would do if I was in your situation. And hopefully that can help you a little bit, because it is a really tough decision. Before making any decisions, like I said earlier, get them in your hands, try them out. What I would do is, if you're watching videos and reading articles on these lenses, have a little paper next to you, and if somebody mentions a weird bug or an error with their lens, or if there's something that somebody says, you know, this lens is really soft at 600, write them down so that when you get the lenses in your hands to try, you can actually test them, and you'll be able to go through your list and hopefully cover everything and know that you're making the right decisions. I didn't cover everything in the video. I covered what I really thought was important and what really stood out to me. If you have any questions about the lenses, if you have any comments, if you have any experiences with either of the lenses, write them down below. I'd love to hear them, and I'll see you in the next video. Happy birding.